thank you so much for the
Yeah.
invitation. And just, I don't know, sometimes it's helpful to, I just want to fill out a little bit more of a picture of who I am. I grew up on a farm about an hour and a half south of Winnipeg between Altona and Gretna. In quite a conservative Mennonite community, Mennonite church, Summerfeld Mennonite for any of you that might mean something. Um, I was baptized in the Evangelical Mennonite Church. Was fortunate to have folks who I think did take the Bible very seriously, and so was taught sort of the what I still hold as the liberatory impulse of the gospel. And so even as I've left that tradition, that impulse has stayed with me, and as a young adult, I drifted around ecclesially. I was part of Harry Lahotsky's church, New Life Ministries, for a number of years in the West End here. Was married at St. Margaret's Anglican by David Whitcomb for years there. Kind of just toured around until I eventually came back to what's called Mennonite Church Canada, so a different expression of the Mennonite Church, which I've been pastoring for about 20 years now. And so the the book that was mentioned is sort of the culmination of me trying to work out a theology as someone who has tried. I've tried my best, but I've rarely found theology that I've enjoyed, found meaningful, found challenging, found informing. And so other than so the book is sort of the outcome of me, but I've always loved studying the Bible, and so as much as that's been a wrestling with, I haven't held to the notions of the Bible that I grew up with, but it's the community of elders that I wrestle with and argue with and listen to and engage with. And so the book is sort of wrestling with the Bible and bringing it in conversation with the streams of liberation theology that came out of Latin America and the Black Church. A lot of that writing was in the 60s, and I still think it's some of the best writing in that area. And what emerged was sort of an image of holiness, which sounds strange, maybe sounds strange, but holiness for me and my understanding from the Bible isn't about piety or moral codes, but it is about the principle of life in the world and in the Bible. That is, when holiness is present, it undoes what needs to be undone and remakes what needs to be remade. And so, a paradigm of that is Isaiah 6 and count Isaiah's vision being undone and remade, and that's the theme. And then holiness gets spread out throughout the world and undoes the world in order to remake it. Um, or the last time you've read through Exodus and Leviticus, and I have a strange fascination with all of that literature. And so you have, sorry, just a second. Um, so you have this elaborate structure of the tabernacle. Um, everything's deeply symbolic. All these rituals that you do, and then at the very heart of that is, so this is all the tabernacle is a holy place, and then in the center you have sort of the Holy of Holies, and so you have. I mean, the imagery, for those of you who've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's there's a golden chest and two cherubs, angels with wings sort of above it. And in the chest is, traditionally in biblical text, I think is the Ten Commandments as well as the Moses rod, perhaps, I
Uh-huh.
think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so what I find funny about the movie is that people thought that the power of it was inside the chest, but it's the presence of God. So it says you have the mercy seat is the cover for that chest. The angels are on top, and then in Exodus it explicitly says, "I will speak to you from above the seat and between the cherubs." So that was an empty space, and so it was
Mm.
always a living relationship, right? Like again, we have these histories of what these laws were, but it was always to create a space in which the living God. So it's, think you think of it as a vocal passage, right? Like this is it's framed, but that space has to be empty. But the basic principle, the basic default of the Bible is that we are idolatrous people. We don't like to keep. So holiness is the space that's meant to be kept empty. That's clear in the creation of the whole elaborate code in Exodus, and all the symbols at the very heart is an empty space above the mercy seat between the cherub's wings. That's supposed to be kept empty. And the default is that people can't do that. We want to have something that we can measure, control, evaluate the world by. And so that I think is a seemingly eternal principle. And so that sense of nothingness, which is key for holiness, I read in the gospel as Jesus, the spaces, first of all, the space in which Jesus was born, a woman without class or marriage, in a place without, kind of dignity and recognition, born in a space of nothing, and that is who Jesus was attentive to. And so, the basic premise of the book is that to seek God's holiness is to seek the spaces that are considered nothing by the world. That's the space that we will be undone and remade in ways that we're called to. So that's sort of in broad um, strokes, sort of what the book is about, and the second and third part are my attempts to gather at those kind of spaces in the world, and bring that sort of critique to the church that I think still tends to want to secure its theology. It tends to still want to believe that it's sufficient in its understanding of the world prior to any relationships, that it won't be sort of fundamentally undone as holiness might call us to at some times. So part of that for me was uh, kind of the question of hope. Actually was, I'll do a couple of readings, and I think maybe that will be enough for some conversation. But hope ended up bookending the book. It was an intro and the conclusion, because um, part of what the theology did for me was sort of put all of my beliefs into a certain judgment. Like, how would I be made accountable to this, to what's considered nothing by the world? How would I sort of discard sort of the measures of value and the things I wanted to hold on to? And I felt hope often carried with it a security in the future that I found just didn't nourish what I needed for the present, or didn't help me to stay attentive to the present. It didn't help me to accept that, as we know, for some people in some situations, things don't get better. Things for some people in some places are hard throughout their life and do not get better. And what does hope mean? What does hope mean in being realistic about those things? It's not saying we don't try to work for change, but for me, it was sort of facing, how do I love in the midst of the fact that I don't know that I can hope that things will get better, or what that would mean in particular situations. So I use the word hope. We have all kinds of definitions, and there might be time to talk about that in small group. I would use the word without thinking, in that I wish for things, I work for things, I still want things to happen. But in Christian theology, we tend to use that term in ways of saying what great hope we have. In this we have our hope, and our hope is not shaken. And I didn't quite know what that meant anymore for myself. I'm assuming in this space, probably a lot of us have always been or moved into a type of liberal theology. So is that hope? Is that in the afterlife? Is that still where this hope is? Biblically, again, that's actually a small sliver of, most of the Old Testament has very little image of a sense of an afterlife. That only emerges in sort of these apocalyptic later literature, when people no longer, when the suffering is just senseless. You used to have hope that if we're obedient, God will bless us. There's sections of the Bible that have that. But that theology became untenable There was sections of, well, hope, God is in control, God can work through anyone in the world. And there was hope in that, but there are certain theologies that just became untenable. And in the face of suffering, there were people that said, well, to keep our faith, we will have hope that after this life, God will sort it out. And so that theology, as my understanding, emerged in a place of suffering that had no other recourse but to understand it as being needed to happen in some other place, because there was no vision of it in the present. Um, and so that sort of feels very perverse when we have such a long Christian history of having an afterlife, of being willing to punish those who are in non-compliance for God's offer. Like that feels very different. But if we're not sure about that hope, then is it hope in progress? That's been the modern, the Western, the Enlightenment trajectory, but is that our hope? And so I sort of had to set some of those things down. So I think I'll just read a little bit from the introduction, and then if there's still time or if it makes sense from the conclusion. So I write this. I do not claim to know what any one person needs for their life. I accept as a basic principle the conflicted nature of being human. We face conflicts, having internalized a variety of experiences and messages, not all of which align or are congruent. A clear example of this is a double bind in which children are set up to be damned if they do, damned if they don't. For example, being encouraged to be themselves and then being criticized for not doing that the right way. Then there are the seemingly intractable conflicts within the very nature of society itself. We need each other to survive, but in relationship, we place unwanted constraints upon each other. We all learn to cope with conflicts in some way or another, from the banal to the bizarre. Some take pleasure in pain. Some stay in lifeless relationships. Others ride the roller coaster of short-lived, volatile flings. Some are unrelenting optimists, and others are thoroughly cynical. Some are dreamers, others hard-nosed realists. While I have always been skeptical of optimists, I have met some people for whom entertaining life otherwise would immediately threaten the presence of overwhelming trauma. So while pessimism has been crucial for me personally, the point of this book is not to be prescriptive for all individuals, but rather help draw attention to the fact that we live in environments that force conflicting and compromising approaches to life on us. While these conflicts are inevitable, we do not need to accept what a given system asks of us. We can, at minimum, learn to name the forces in this world. Indeed, there are biblical and theological threads that can help us to name some of the forces that press so hard against us and, in fact, cause us to sin. Just as importantly, there's a thread reminding us of how to resist these forces. This book is pessimistic because it is an attempt to find out what sort of judgment the gospel places on the church and the world. It is pessimistic because I see the seemingly inevitable forms and measures and values that endure in the world through the exclusion and oppression of others. All that said, this book is meant to be good news, because there is another way of life that can only come from the places that have been discounted as nothing. For Christians, this is the incarnation, and with it, the way of discipleship. While I accept that most of us are coping with life as best we can, I do think it is important to make time and reflect on our coping strategies. Inasmuch as I want to reject cynicism, I also do not think that hope and optimism, as commonly expressed, should be easily or quickly trusted. What I have tended to find in hope, optimism, and cynicism is either a protective shrinking back from or an active defense against things that feel unbearable. What if God is not in control? What if things do not get better? What if meaning cannot and should not be made of some things? Armed with either optimism or cynicism, we tend to shrink back from or cover over places where it seems there is no answer, where there is nothing at all. Such questions and places can be our guides when we do not quickly fill them with false hope. This book and the image of holiness that it interprets from the gospel and the Bible both call us to acknowledge that nothing is sacred. Christ came as a lowly figure, as one who was counted as nothing to the world. The spectral idea that love is beyond our control is ultimately unbearable to us, so much so that we will kill to resolve and smooth over the space that raises seemingly unbearable thoughts and conflicts. It is the promise of the gospel and biblical holiness that if we are willing to gather in these places counted for nothing by the world, places for which no form or measure is adequate, then we will be undone, but also remade. We are called to die and be born again. Understanding the need for nothing, the need to honor a place beyond my understanding and the world's measures, I found myself becoming increasingly pessimistic about hope. Instead of sustaining and encouraging me, I found that expressions of hope took my mind away from the present and limited my capacity to pay attention to what matters. Hope tends to come with a formed idea about the future. Here it is tempting to let our minds flee to those idealized places while being prone to projecting that imagined future onto the present. The problem with this practice is how it diminishes our ability to be mutually formed by each other and accountable to the present. I haven't found that such hope has helped me to love. I haven't found that such hope increases my faith. Instead, I see such hope being used to disavow something that needs to be acknowledged in the present. Perhaps this bad thing never really will change. Perhaps there is no solution, but I can still love and struggle. I don't know that it is healthy or appropriate to have hope that something good will happen, because we know that's not true. Good Friday teaches us that indeed the very worst thing can happen. Easter Sunday should always be a surprise, that is at first disbelieved and then accepted. If there is hope, then I believe it will be heard from our commitment to love and faith, regardless of the future. So, yeah, I don't know how that language lands. It's very concrete for me. I think of a loved one with chronic, um, very deep mental illness that, what does it mean to love without hope, to be hopelessly in love with this person, knowing it may never get better? What does it mean to gather in spaces, of people that have been systematically oppressed in ways that are under we're under the best when we think of the world today. These are under some of the best of the conditions we can imagine, but for some of us, not for others. And um, to simply be present and to believe that these are holy places, and that that is where I hope to hear hope to hear hope. There we go. So that's the language I use. Um, and that's not to idealize poverty or to think that this is some communion of saints. People are people wherever you go, but those are the sites that we're called to gather at.